I work as a high school math consultant at one of Texas's 20 education service centers, which you're seeing a map of here that kind of span the entire state of Texas. And I work for Region 18 out here in West Texas, and you'll see that geographically we are the largest region in Texas. Here's some more information on the counties that exist within our region, just to kind of give you an idea of how big our region is. We stretch from kind of Big Spring in the northeast over to Van Horn in the west, down to Presidio and Terlingua in the south. And our service center is located up here in Midland, Texas, and some schools are 4 or 4.5 hours away from that service center. So it's this very large geographic region. And throughout this geographic region, we also have very few large cities, even small towns. And so many of our school districts are geographically isolated with small schools where one teacher may teach a particular subject or grade span or grade level at their school. So as such, online learning and collaboration are very important parts of professional development for teachers throughout our region because traditional face-to-face professional development is sometimes prohibitive. This is our ESC 18 math page for math professional development, and I'm showing you the calendar from January just to show some of the sessions that I'm highlighting as part of this action research. So twice a month, I would host After the Bell webinars. So you'll see one here on January 14th. There's a high school version, and then there's also an elementary version led by another consultant. And then 2 weeks later, there's another high school session. So twice a month, we host these sessions, and teachers can register for them through our workshop system. So they would go to this page and register, and once they're registered, they would receive an email like this from me, which has the connection information for how to connect to that webinar that particular day. And so we use Adobe Connect for our webinars. Participants would log in from their own computer, so they don't have to come to a face-to-face session. And these webinars would run from 4:15 till 5:15, kind of right after the school day lets out, and so we called them the After the Bell webinars. And typically we have about 5 to 7 teachers who participate in these live webinars. So the topic of each After the Bell webinar was selected based on a data analysis we did of our regional kind of STAR and end of course data that helped us determine what the weak SEs or student expectations were across the region. And so from there we were able to identify some instructional hotspots, some kind of big topics that as a region we really weren't performing well on, and we selected those topics to be the topics for these webinars. So in order to show you kind of what the webinar looks like, I'm going to play just the first minute of this recording from a webinar back in January, so before I'd done my action research, just to kind of give you an idea of how these are set up and what components are included in the webinar. Okay, well, welcome to this week's After the Bell for high school math. We're going to talk about conjecturing about circles, kind of an interesting topic in high school geometry, and one that starts with material that our students are familiar with, but quickly branches off into new territory. And so here we're going to look at some different explorations, practice, all kinds of ideas for how we can help our students tackle this idea. So same agenda as usual. We'll start with the curriculum pieces, looking at a particular standard and its specificity, talk about some key understandings or big ideas, look at some sample questions related to this topic, and then look at some different possible lesson sequences, wrapping up with a little bit of reflective writing about what we think of some of these ideas. So this action research project was undertaken to allow me to explore some ideas for increasing teacher engagement and learning in these After the Bell webinars. With this understanding, I embarked on a literature review about webinars and online professional development. So I kind of sequenced my research around 2 ideas. The first is the benefits of online professional development in general. So for example, Laux, Harsley, Stiles, Mundry, Love, and Hewson in their 2010 work share a lot of ideas about how important it is to consider the goals of the PD program when you're designing your professional development experience, that different learning targets align better with different formats for professional development. In their book, they talk about online professional development specifically and how it really is ideally suited for enhancing teachers' content knowledge and also for building professional learning communities. Not so well suited towards other PD objectives, but really well suited to those. Now, these are actually the two goals of our After the Bell webinars, to build content knowledge and to develop PLCs. And so this really reaffirmed that the After the Bells are a good mechanism to meet those professional development goals. Further, they talked about what makes online professional development effective for enhancing teachers' content knowledge and building PLCs. What is it about this format that works? And one characteristic is access, which is really critical in our region, because as we talked about earlier, it's this massive geographical region where many teachers feel very isolated in their profession with their specific subjects. Further research from the National Research Council talks about how online professional development programs can be particularly adept at creating these professional learning communities. So they say online technologies in general and some kinds of online professional teacher development programs in particular can help build a community that is so often missing from the daily lives of teachers. For many teachers, these professional learning communities with other educators who are separated by distance represent one of the best features of online PD programs. So again, just really reinforcing that the After the Bell model is a good model for the PD goals that we have for it. The second area of my research then delved deeper, said, okay, so if online professional development is a good model for what we want to do, what do we know about that model? What are some best practices for these short 1-hour webinar experiences? One of the roadblocks I found was that very little research has been done on the effects of online PD on teachers or their students. And much of this research that exists is anecdotal or case-specific. However, this really is an emerging field and a very important field right now, and so we do find that the research base in this regard is growing. Talking a little bit about the current lack of research or maybe under-research, Dee Dee and I'll explain, although online teacher professional development programs are propagating rapidly and consuming substantial resources both fiscally and logistically, little is known about best practices for the design and implementation of these OTPD models. Evidence of effectiveness is often lacking, anecdotal, or based on participant surveys completed immediately after the PD experience rather than later, when a better sense of long-range impact is attainable. And this will actually be a concern in my action research as well, this ability to get data that goes beyond an immediate participant survey to really evaluate the effectiveness of the program. So after kind of looking at those overarching themes, I wanted some specifics. So I dug into research looking for some best practices and came up with two that were applicable to my line of work and that I wanted to try to implement. So one recommendation from current research is to consider how you design your webinars and how they're divided into timed chunks. So Cantor provided these 4 options for planning a 1-hour webinar. You could do a 50-minute non-stop presentation followed by Q&A at the end. This is really how I've done webinars in the past, including the webinar we were just looking at. So this is the webinar format I used for the first webinar that I'm using in this action research, the February 2014 webinar. However, it's not necessarily the best model. So she presents other models such as 4 12-minute chunks with breaks where there's a Q&A in between the chunks, or 4 12-minute chunks with breaks and then reflective questions and peer sharing between the chunks. So this is actually the model that I implemented as one of my interventions, if you will, to kind of test out and see what difference it would make. And so this is the model I used for my March 2014 webinar, kind of my post-webinar, if you will. And then the fourth model is 2 12-minute chunks, reflective questions, peer sharing, and application of content. So I really only used 2 of these models. The first model, which had been my previous way of doing webinars, and then this was my new kind of intervention to see how it changed participant engagement and learning. Now, Cantor contends that these later models, so including the third one, which I implemented, and then the fourth one, are more effective and engaging than kind of the sit and get type webinar experiences. Also, she talks about how these peer-driven approaches with their intentional breaks and reflective questioning provides participants with much needed time to process and interact with the material that's being shared with them in the webinar. A second option, or a second intervention that I looked at, was valuing the importance of pre-work disseminated to registered participants in advance. So as Young talks about, the first aim of good prep when you're designing a webinar is to get participants ready to participate. And so he shared a number of ideas from different forms of research about what this might look like. One was just reminder emails, so sending out reminder emails a week in advance and a few days in advance, as well as the day of, as well as sending out kind of a pre-webinar survey that was designed to solicit questions from the registered audience before the webinar. So it had participants think about, what do I want to get out of this? What am I wondering about this? And it really kind of vested them in the webinar process. The questions are also powerful because they can be used to refine the webinar as I'm designing it to meet the particular participant's needs. So that kind of overviews the research I looked at and the two kind of instructional shifts that I pulled out from the research that I wanted to try out in my action research. Chunking the webinar, so designing it differently that way, and then using a pre-webinar survey and reminder emails to see how that changed teacher engagement and learning during the webinar. So here's some of the recording from the February 2014 webinar, which looked at solving quadratic equations. The March webinar actually looked at a different topic, of course, but actually a topic from another course. It looked at triangle similarity, which is more a geometry concept, whereas this was an Algebra 1, Algebra 2 concept. However, all of those topics were decided months in advance, and so as such couldn't be changed. For this February webinar, I planned it as I had planned all my previous webinars, so without taking the two interventions into play. 5 participants registered for this webinar, but only 3 attended, and of those 3, 2 were teachers and 1 was a district level mathematics administrator. Then here's the recording from the March webinar, and I'm going to go ahead and play the beginning of this. And 11 participants registered for this webinar, of which 10 attended, 7 teachers, 2 district level math coordinators, and 1 parent whose data was not used in the data set. 3 participants actually attended both webinars, the February and the March webinars. So here we are looking at the March webinar, and I'm going to play the next little segment of this webinar where we'll look at how this webinar was designed differently than how I had designed webinars in the past. And so I'll be explaining to participants both the agenda, but how it's kind of broken into chunks where there will be opportunities for them to reflect and discuss kind of along the way. Okay, so our agenda for today, we're going to start with the actual standards, the current standards at the high school level, and then we'll talk a little bit about where those standards are going, looking at big ideas as well. And then we're going to pause right there and kind of talk about what parts of those standards your students do well with and where they struggle. Then we'll look at some of the released questions we have, some of the star type questions, and then we'll pause again and see what do those questions tell us. Do they add any value? Then we'll look at some different activities that you could possibly use when teaching similar triangles and similar figures. And then at the end, I'm going to try to wrap up about 10 minutes early, so about 5:05, in order to give you time to complete a survey for us. So in addition to chunking the March webinar, I also implemented the interventions of sending out the pre-work emails with a survey to solicit questions. So here's the pre-work email that was sent out the day before the webinar, which had never been done before. Just a reminder, here's the information, here's what we're going to review with the particular standard that we'll look at. And then if you have any favorite resources, please bring them along to the webinar. Also, what questions do you have about this topic? Feel free to quickly submit them here so they can be addressed. And when participants click on that link, it took them to this Google form where they could type in questions they would like to have answered during the webinar, as well as their name and organization. And so this is how I used kind of that pre-work reminder email sent the day before, also the day of, to solicit questions and kind of pull people back to the webinar that they had registered for. As you'll see in this next little piece, both the February and the March webinars were ended 10 minutes early to provide participants with time to complete a survey.
And like I said, we did want to wrap up early today because I want to give you time to complete this feedback survey. Like I said earlier, we're trying to refine and enhance these offerings so they're more of what you want and less of what you don't want. So if you'll take a minute, and I know some of you completed this survey a couple weeks ago or a month ago, but if you'll also complete it again, because we've made some changes already, and we want to get some of your feedback on the things we've changed so far and on your thoughts about that. So if you will, if you'll just click on the link at the bottom of this screen, it will take you to a Google form, and it should take you at most 5 minutes to complete. If you'll do that now, and then if you have other questions, I'll hang out for a while and see how else I can help.
So then when participants clicked on the link at the bottom, they were taken to this online survey, which was created in Google Forms, and which I then analyzed for patterns after the February session and after the March session to see what areas there had been growth in based on the interventions that were implemented in that March webinar. And all 3 participants at the February webinar completed this anonymous survey, and all 10 participants at the March webinar also completed this survey. So what were the results of these interventions? Well, data from the survey was analyzed, and also data from the chat logs, and we'll kind of look at some highlights from both of those. So some patterns that could be noticed is there does appear to be some growth in participants' prior contemplation of topics. So you see, for example, here on question number 6, once notified of the webinar's topic, I contemplate and bring effective activities that I already use to the webinar to share with others, grew from 2 to 2.2. Now these are scaled scores from 1 to 4 on the survey, so 4 is the highest, averaged out over all the participants at the February webinar who completed the survey, and then those who completed it after the March webinar. So we see a 0.2 point growth there, and that may be due in part to the pre-webinar survey that was sent out, encouraging people to think about and bring ideas related to that topic. We also see slight growth in the active engagement and exploration throughout the webinar, as experienced by increase on this question. I click on and explore links shared in these webinars. So we're did participants have time to really explore all of the different things that were shared? And we see a 0.2 point growth between those 2 webinars. So that may be due to the chunked design that I used in that second webinar, where we would do 10 to 12 minutes of instruction, 5 minutes of reflection and exploration, 10 minutes of instruction, 5 minutes of exploration. There was more time built into the webinar to really encourage that active engagement and exploration. Also, we see a little bit of growth in extension of the discussion beyond the webinar itself. As exhibited in question number 1, I talk about ideas from these webinars with other educators, which increased 0.1 points after the interventions were put in play in March. Part of that might be because using the chunked approach, at 4 times throughout the webinar, participants were posed reflective questions that they then answered to the entire group and then commented on with the entire group. So they had an opportunity to discuss the topics of the webinar first with each other, knew what they would maybe want to say, and then maybe what they would want to go share with someone else. So those are some of the areas of growth that we noted from the survey. Also, though, the chat logs were analyzed, and the chat logs were not shown in the previous segments. They were blurred out to protect the anonymity of the participants. But we did see that participants had an increase from 4 to 4.4, and this is a measure of how many comments per person were made on average. So we analyzed the logs to look at the total number of comments, the total number of responses to each other, etc., divided by the number of people who are present, and we did see more comments per person in that second webinar. And that also may be due to that chunked approach where the presenter was intentionally throwing the conversation back to the participants more often throughout the webinar. So while the data from these webinars remains anecdotal at best because of the very low sample size and also because of the novice survey design, it's definitely not a professional level survey. There were some implications that we've just looked at, but there are also next steps for this type of research that would take it even further. And so those might include developing a better survey or measurement instrument, implementing a survey 1 week post-webinar to see what participants really used in their classrooms versus what they thought they would use at the end of the webinar, and then testing these approaches in webinars with a larger number of participants. So as we wrap up this video, some final thoughts. The initial anecdotal data from this action research project suggests that these two instructional approaches that we identified and looked at, the pre-webinar survey and then using a segmented or chunked instructional design in the webinar, may in fact lead to an increase in participant engagement and learning.